Hello, this is Todd Lewis, the host of the Praise of Folly podcast, here to be joined with Keith Preston on part 2 of our discussion of anarchism. Now, Keith Preston, since we're talking about anarchism, one of the, I think, first and most obvious things we should try to define is the state. How, as an anarchist, would you define the state, and how has anarchism historically defined the state?
Well, as with every other thing that anarchists debate, there's not a general consensus of opinion, even on what the state actually is. But what I can give you, I suppose, is what the prevailing views have been, or what some of the most prevalent views have been among the leading thinkers within anarchism. The bulk of anarchists would probably agree with the definition of the state that you find in thinkers like Max Weber. Max Weber was a social scientist and historian, economist, a lot of things, a German who lived in the early 19th century, for those who aren't familiar, the early 20th century, for those who aren't familiar with him. But Max Weber once said that the state is an institution that claims a monopoly on the use of violence within a particular geographical region. And that's a fairly good working definition of the state. The state is an organization that says only we can use violence within this particular territory that we control, that we have borders set up around. And this concept of the state goes back to the Treaty of Westphalia that came at the end of the 30 Years' War in the 1600s. In 1648, when the 30 Years' War was concluded, the agreement was basically that the waging of war would be restricted to the state, that is, the king, the sovereign. Before that, wars were waged by all kinds of people, everyone from the church to mercenaries to feudal lords and their own armies and that kind of thing. It was fairly similar to the kind of warlord type warfare you might find in certain parts of the world today. But the Treaty of Westphalia established this idea of a monopoly on war on the part of the state, or monopoly on violence on the part of the state. And that has more or less defined the state, I think, as much as anything else ever since then, in the roughly almost 400 years since then. Now, when we go back and look at the state historically in a wider context, Peter Kropotkin, who was one of the godfathers of classical anarchism, one of the big names in the history of anarchism, he argued that the ancient Greek cities were not states. He didn't consider those to be states, and he also didn't consider...
Neither did Murray Bookchin.
Yeah, and Bookchin didn't either. And Kropotkin also did not consider the medieval republics to be states. What some of the theorists of classical anarchism, and then their modern interpreters like Bookchin, argued was that in the ancient world, the states that you had, or the prototypical states that you had, were the empires. The Roman Empire, for example, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, all of these great empires that existed in the ancient world were states, or served the same function as states in modernity. But they tended to dispute the idea of whether the Greek cities or the medieval republics and institutions like that could really be considered states. And I think this leads to a lot of debate about semantics when it comes to the debate of over what anarchism is. For example, there are people left and right who are opponents of anarchism who have a different version of what the state is. There are some people on the right, people with a more traditionalist or conservative, quote unquote, or perspective, who will argue that the state is an organic institution. They will say that the state is just an outgrowth of natural society. They'll say you've got the family, you've got the clan, you've got the tribe, you've got the community, and out of that comes the state. The state is a natural outgrowth of these organic social institutions that just exist by virtue of the nature of things. That's a standard argument for the state that you have coming from the right, and they will cite, thinkers as diverse as Aristotle or various theologians or whatever to justify this perspective. And of course, on the left, you have versions of the state, theorists of the state who see the state either as a social contract where, and this theory is implicitly based in the ideas of Hobbes and Locke, where individuals by contract, at least implicitly, cede their sovereignty to the state in return for the benefits of civilization, order, and protection from crime and things like that. The standard Hobbesian view of the state, that order is the highest value. You've got to cede the individual sovereignty to the state in order for civilization to exist. And then after Hobbes comes Locke, this idea that the state exists to protect rights. And then Jean-Jacques Rousseau and some of the early theorists of modern democracy who see the state as this manifestation of the popular will and popular sovereignty. And that gets into modern democratic theories of the state about, the state is the voice of the people. The government of the people, for the people, by the people, that kind of thing. So leftists and rightists have a somewhat different version of what the state is. The left views it as this kind of manifestation of popular sovereignty. The right views the state as sort of an organic institution that's an outgrowth of natural society. Obviously, being an anarchist, I think both of those points of view of what the state is are problematic. I tend to have a view of the state that I think was pretty well defined by Franz Oppenheimer. Franz Oppenheimer was a German social scientist about the same time as Max Weber, and he wrote a relatively short book. I think it's just called The State, where he talks about the origins of the state being in plunder and conquest. And Oppenheimer, to my knowledge, wasn't an anarchist. I think he was more just like a classical liberal type. But if you compare Oppenheimer's ideas with those of anarchists, left and right anarchists, you see a great deal of overlap. And that if you look at these older societies that became states or prototypical states, well, how did they become that? Well, they did it through plunder and conquest. I mean, how did the Romans become what they were? How did the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, how did they become what they were? They did it through plunder and conquest. And the same is true of modern states. I've had many debates over the years, particularly with liberals and leftists, more with liberals and leftists than conservatives or right-wingers. But liberals and leftists will try to argue that modern states are somehow different from these ancient states, that, how dare you compare modern democracy with the Roman Empire? And I'm like, well, look at what it does in practice and function. It's, you have Rome on the Potomac, and then you have Rome in Rome. But there is this idea that the state is somehow an outgrowth of some sort of organic society that I think anarchists don't share. Anarchists, this is a good analogy for, I think, what amounts to the anarchist view of the state. The analogy would be to the mafia. In New York City, you've got the five families, the mafia families, the legendary ones, the Gambinos, the Bonanos, the Colombos, the Lucisis, and the Genoveses. And each of those five families controls a certain amount of territory in New York and surrounding areas. And that mafia system has been in place ever since the 1930s, when Lucky Luciano, the famous gangster, actually created that system in order to cut down violence within the mafia. The problem was, within the mafia itself, you had so much violence and so many mafia guys killing each other over territory and things like that. Lucky Luciano said, well, we've got to end this. Okay, so you guys just take that, and you guys take that territory. And that's more or less the system the mafia's had ever since. And the governing council of the mafia is this thing called the commission, and the different crime families have a representative on this commission, and they elect a president of the commission, and they collectively decide who they're going to assassinate or whatever. But let's say that the mafia were to decide, well, next time we have a decision over who is going to be chairman of the commission of the five families, why don't we let the public vote? Why don't we put it on TV on what's the TV series, Star Search or something like that? Let's let the public vote for who's going to be head of the mafia. Well, that's more or less the way anarchists would be inclined to see the democratic state, in that the state exists for the same reasons that the mafia exists. The mafia exists why? To monopolize territory, monopolize resources, protect an artificially empowered ruling class, that is, people that basically make their living robbing everybody else. expand its own power, exploit its subjects, people that are subject to either criminal acts carried out by the mafia or people who are, victims of shakedown rackets and things like that. And really, states, according to the anarchist view, work in the same way. Now, the people will come back, defenders of the state will come back and say, well, the state does a lot of things people like, a lot of things people want. The state provides for social welfare programs. The state provides services like roads and schools and all this kind of thing. And the anarchist answer to that is, well, so does the mafia. The mafia provides certain things that some people want. They provide protection, genuine protection to some people who need it under certain circumstances. They provide certainly certain goods that some people want, whether it's drugs or prostitutes or gambling services or something like that. So you see this same gray area among organized crime that you do among states. But it's also true that states have their own legitimation ceremonies and coronation ceremonies in the same way that the mafia does. There are ex-mafia members who will talk about their initiation ritual, and people who've been in criminal gangs of any type will talk about this. About how you've got your initiation ritual, you've got this rite, you've got this ceremony. You've got the organizational flags and logos and all this kind of stuff. It's all the trappings that states have, and the anarchist critique of the state differs from that of the left and the right in that the state is not just a matter of the social contract where individuals have ceded their sovereignty to the state in order for protection from crime or whatever, the Hobbesian view of the state or the Lockean view of the state. An anarchist would reject the more right-wing or conservative view of the state, that the state is somehow an organic outgrowth of society. The anarchists would say that the state is more like a parasite on society. The state is more like the mafia or more like a criminal organization. It's an organization of people who live parasitically off other people through violence, through force, through protection rackets, through shaking down people, essentially through protecting artificially empowered elites with which it's aligned and things of that nature. So, that's the anarchist view of the state, is simply the mafia with a flag.
Yeah. One of the thorny issues, let's go back to the general definition that we get about the state as a monopoly of force by Max Faber. And they say, it's a monopoly of force in a given geographic region. One of the problems that I've had with anarcho-capitalism is that every private landholder, by that definition, is a state. Because every private landholder has a monopoly of force on the land that he owns. And for that matter, it's the same problem for the anarchist left. If you have a commune on the anarchist left, say, transgender, Black, Jew, whatever, you're all in, we're all inclusive. But if some white nationalist skinheads or some Islamic fundamentalists or some Aztec, heart eaters showed up, they'd probably say, hit the road, Jack. But how would they do that without exercising a monopoly of force on the commune? It seems to me somewhat semantical.
Yeah, and this is, again, an argument that goes round for round in anarchist circles. There are anarchists of different types who have different views on immigration, as I said in the previous podcast that we did, and that's one of the arguments that is often invoked, is that there are some anarchists, particularly anarcho-capitalists, who are actually in favor restricted immigration for whatever reason, and they will say, well, look, in a society without a state, there'd be plenty of private property owners saying who and who can't come on their land, and even, as you said, among an anarcho-communist society, you would certainly have communes saying who and who can't come in. And then there's the issue, well, aren't these institutions just de facto states? Aren't anarcho-communist communes or anarcho-capitalist, whatever kind of, contractual communities or with their private defense agencies and things like that, aren't those de facto states? And by saying that other people can't come in, aren't they essentially claiming a monopoly on the use of violence as well? And then there's a related issue that comes up as well. What about people inside these institutions? For example, should an anarcho-capitalist property owner be able to decide, anybody that comes on my land that I don't want, I'm just going to kill them. I'm going to shoot them or hang them from the nearest tree or whatever. And the same thing is true with anarcho-communist communes. You mentioned different types of groups that anarcho-communists wouldn't like much, white nationalist skinheads or cultural reactionaries. Well, if can an anarcho-communist commune say we're going to have the death penalty for someone who acts in a transphobic way or something like that? And that gets into some really interesting questions about, what is the state? Is it something that simply claims a monopoly on force? Within an anarcho-capitalist system, if someone says, well, I'm not going to recognize this particular private defense agency and their laws or legal system, I'm going to have one of my own. And in fact, many anarcho-capitalists do have this theory of competing legal theories and competing legal systems and competing defense agencies. And then the argument against that's raised is, well, isn't that just warfare between people trying to impose their own system of law? So it's a good question. It's a good question. Now, some of the counter arguments are, well, there's all kinds of institutions and organizations that have a system of internal self-government and that claim some kind of right of exclusion, but aren't really states. For example, one example might be university campuses. University campuses are certainly kind of like many states in a way. They have a governmental structure, they have land, they have territory, they have institutional policies, and they can theoretically, even though most of them are semi-public in terms of accessibility and things like that, they still have the right to deny admittance to students they don't want. They can fire employees they don't want. There are certainly certain buildings and properties on university campuses that are restricted, where not just anyone can go in there, in addition to something like the park or the library that tends to be more open to the public. But wouldn't an anarcho-communist or anarcho-capitalist community really not be that much different from, say, a university, where technically there's limitations on who can go in and out, but it's not really a state. Now, the other side of that is, well, yeah, but institutions like universities are actually relying on the public police to keep out people they don't want. And a lot of large college campuses, and even a lot of not so large ones, have their own security forces and even their own police departments. The university that I teach at has its own police department, literally, and it's with the power of arrest and all that kind of.
Very anarcho-capitalist.
Huh? What's that?
I said very anarcho-capitalist.
Yeah, it is in a way. It is in a way, and you can argue that it's certainly possible to have a non-state organization that even has its own police that keeps out unwanted people and things like that. Or an anarcho-communist, either one. You can have an anarcho-communist commune that has its own militia or whatever. So if the skinheads or the capitalists or the reactionaries or transphobes or whatever try to come in, well, we're going to keep them out. And then there's the question of, well, when does that become a state? Some people say, well, that's no different than if you have a house and you refuse to invite someone you don't like into your house, or if someone's in and they're, being disruptive or whatever, you kick them out. And other people say, well, where do you draw the line between that and what has to happen for that to become a state? So it's sort of I don't think there's really any clear dividing line there as to when something really, where you can really say, now we have a state. I think that when you have a system that's built up around exploitation, that's a fairly good dividing line, in terms of a state versus some other institution that simply can exclude other people, even by force if necessary. Of course, that gets into the question of what is exploitation, and
well, exactly. I think that's good.
Well, the anarcho-capitalists basically say if you're using violence to extort labor or money or property or whatever from some other person, then that's exploitation. The anarcho-communists, they go a bit further and they say, well, if you are monopolizing resources in a way that other people are dependent on you economically, that's also exploitation. I think a case can be made for both of those points of view. I think that in a society where, even if it's technically stateless, but the land and wealth is all controlled by a handful of people and everybody else is more or less at their mercy, if not physically, at least for sustenance, I think you could argue that's a system of exploitation. A good example are company towns that of the kind that existed in the Industrial Revolution. Rothbard was actually fairly defensive of company towns, whereas Friedrich von Hayek actually criticized them, saying, well, no, they were actually de facto states. But a company town would function, something like a corporate fiefdom. One of the criticisms that anarchists of the left have of anarcho-capitalists is they say, well, anarcho-capitalism in practice would just be corporate fiefdoms, and company towns were kind of an example of a corporate fiefdom. We actually had a company that had a factory, and everybody in the town works in the factory, and there's not many options as far as employment, unless you want to go out into the hinterlands and till the land, or maybe sell trinkets on the street or something. So everyone is pretty much dependent on this company for employment. But then not only do you receive your wage from the company, but you receive your housing from the company. You shop at company-owned stores. Your paycheck is deducted for services that the company provides for you. And in fact, there are some states now, some countries that work that way. Dubai is a good example. Dubai is a type of a fiefdom that is a mega capitalist entity, city state or whatever, if you will. But then they have all of these foreign workers who are de facto serfs or indentured servants, or who were treated like slaves in many instances. And that system is their system is very class centric. I mean, they still have debtors' prisons in Dubai. So those are the kind of arguments that anarchists of the left will make against anarcho-capitalism, and they'll say, well, isn't that just an example of an oppressive state? So there is something of a continuum. I'd argue that the dividing line between authoritarianism and libertarianism, or anarchy and statism, or whatever, is probably more of a continuum than some straight line that can really be demarked, and say, okay, this is it. Step over this line. You've got statism, you've got authoritarianism. I tend to, here's an analogy I've used before. If we want to say that, okay, anarchism on a scale of 1 to 100, we can say, okay, we've got the perfect anarchist utopias. We've got the ideals of Rothbard, Stirner, Proudhon, William Godwin, Kropotkin, whomever. Okay, that's 100. The perfect, your anarchist utopia, however you envision it. That's 100. Then 0 is some kind of totalitarian nightmare. 0 is Kim Jong-un, or Hitler, or Stalin, or Pol Pot. All right. But within that 0 to 100 scale, there's obviously a wide range of points of view and institutions and societies. A little less anarchistic than the anarchist utopias would be, your limited government libertarians, your classical liberals, your constitutionalists, or your liberalitarians, or your liberal civil libertarians. I mean, there's still a difference between, say, the ACLU on the left and the Soviet Union, or there's still a difference between, say, the Libertarian Party on one hand and fascist Italy. So you can step down from an anarchist utopia down to a limited government, libertarian, liberal, small government utopia. Most nations around the world, if we're using this 0 to 100 scale, are probably somewhere in the 30 to 70 range. There are some governments that come pretty
North
close.
Korea is probably 100 though. Or 0. I mean, it's probably 0.
Well, yeah, North Korea was probably the 0 mark. As far as a 30, Cuba is probably in the 30, 40 range or something like that. Somewhere like Switzerland is probably in the 70 range. And most governments around the world are somewhere in between that. You've got, China, and again, it gets down to, well, how do you even rate a society's authoritarianism? What criteria do you use? And you actually have these organizations, that actually try to rate the freedom index of a particular nation or whatever. I've always been very distrustful of those, because it always seems to me that the criteria they're using is very arbitrary, and it's usually shaped by political interest. They'll say, well, okay, this society has a very high freedom rating because they're business friendly. They're open to foreign trade and investment, even though they've actually got a police state or something like Singapore. Or this particular society over here has a high freedom rating because they're allied with the United States. So there's a lot of bias that I see in those kinds of evaluations. But I do think it's possible to look at different nations around the world and measure their degree of authoritarianism versus libertarianism or anarchy versus statism according to reasonably objective criteria. Do they generally allow dissent politically? Do they allow alternative points of view to be heard politically? Do they have open access to information? Is it possible to criticize the government in the press or on the internet without being thrown in jail? Is it possible? Do people have a reasonable means of being able to make a living successfully? Can people practice whatever the religion they want without being persecuted? And you see a wide range of variables when it comes to things like that in different countries, and in some countries can be really off the scale in one direction, and on one hand on some issues, and be fairly libertarian in other directions. For example, I would personally rather live in one of the Scandinavian countries than I would in Castro's Cuba. At the same time, the kind of hostility to men that you see among the Swedish feminists is something I don't know that I'd want to put up with. It might be better to be a man in Cuba in every other way. If you're interested in, say, living in a society where you can be an entrepreneur, a business person with a very minimal amount of regulations, you're probably better off, say, in Hong Kong than you would be in some other place, or maybe Singapore or somewhere like that. But if free speech is really what you care about, then you definitely want to be in one of the Western societies, even if it's a very state-centric social democracy, because you can generally get away with saying more in those countries than you can in a lot of the Asian countries. So a lot of it just comes down to individual values. If smoking pot is your thing, then you want to be in Holland. If being able to say whatever you want to politically and get away with it, America has pretty good free speech laws. So it all comes down to individual preferences in many ways.
Well, that the last part kind of reminds me of an anarchist world anyhow, because in an anarchist world, you're going to have the very same problems. Do you want pro-business? Well, move to the ANCAP stand. If you want to have, more equal distribution of wealth, go to Chomskyville. If you want to be all about number one, go to, Max Stirner Town. So in many ways, the same problems will continue. But well,
I'm glad. Well, before you get into the next point, one thing I would add to that is one thing that's often ignored in these kinds of debates about what an ideal political system is. And this is true not just among anarchists, but it's true among the left and the right generally. And that's the question of scale. For example, in mainstream American political discourse in particular, there's this constant back and forth between the Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, lefts and right, red and blue, different racial and ethnic groups, different religious and cultural communities, about policy or about who's most oppressed, are blacks more oppressed by police brutality, or whites more oppressed by affirmative action, or, gays more oppressed by religion? Is religion more oppressed by gays? Is men more oppressed by women, or women more oppressed by men? But there's never really any challenge given to this idea of, well, do we really need to have a singular system for 320 million people? And it seems to me a lot of the problem is rooted in that. A lot of the problem is we have a very divert. Now, I know a lot of people listen to this may not even be in the United States. I don't know where your audience is, but I assume a lot of people listen to this are in the United States. And in the United States, we have one of the most diverse societies in the world. We also have the third most heavily populated society in the world. And is it really even possible to have a singular political system for 320 million people, containing all kinds of value systems in a way that's really going to make anyone happy.
Well, even when we had 3 million people, the anti-federalists said that wasn't possible, even with 3 million.
Exactly. Even with 3 million people, you had the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and the pro and anti-slavery and all of that. And so I think questions of scale are important. The more localized, the more decentralized a political unit is, the lower the exit costs, meaning it's easier for people who don't like what's going on there to simply leave. The more easy it is for people to actually exercise control over whatever kind of institutions they have. And also the more likely there is to be consensus about values. One thing that a lot of people champion, a lot of anarchists really champion the idea of diversity, because, anarchists tend to, like diversity for whatever reason. There's a wide range of reasons why anarchists like it, diversity. They have anarchists and of the left who really get on the diversity bandwagon. Now that's a big, catchword on the left. But you have anarchists of the right, anarcho-capitalists, who say, I like diversity. I like Mexican restaurants. I like Chinese food. I like lots of different kinds of sports, and I like all that. All right. But it's also, and there's a lot of good things about diversity, but the other side of diversity is the more diversity you have, the harder it is to have a consensus about some basic values. It's kind of like, think about how on a university campus or in a high school, you pull all the different cliques together. All right. So like say on a university campus, let's get the preppy fraternity people, sorority people together with the Rastafarian people, with the hippie types, the punk rock people, and the heavy metal people, and the hip hop rapper people, and the goth music people, and then all the different ethnic groups, and all the different religious and political factions. Let's get all these together and try to create a basic value system for everyone. Well, obviously you can't really do that very well.
That'll be a mess.
Yeah, but that's really how modern democratic states work. It's about trying to bring all of these kinds of warring groups under the same political roof and try to have some kind of common system of values that nobody's really going to be able to agree on. So scale, I think, is very important.
Yeah. I was just going to say that you brought up a lot of very interesting points. A couple of points that I want to hit on are, looking at anarchism and the difficulty of defining the state. I really like your continuum position. I kind of view of it as not a difference in kind, but a difference in degree. So rather than having like, oh, you cross this line, you're over the line now. It's like, no, it's just kind of a difference of degree. You have more or less of something. One of the things that the anarchists, anarcho-capitalists will point out that I've dealt with, and I find it wholly unconvincing, is they'll say, well, no, we're not really a state because we don't use taxes. We're funded privately. And I'm like, well, so the mafia is a family, and my parents have a family. The mafia makes money illegally, and my parents make money legally. Your revenue stream is irrelevant to whether you're a family or not. The definition, this is a family, is independent of the revenue stream. And I believe that this is a state is independent of the revenue stream, and it's a kind of ad hoc, not wholly convincing position. And on the left, we have a similar problem. They'll say, well, we're not a state because we're acting in the interest of the working class, and we're not acting in a class interest. But in fact, they do act in class interests, because in any anarcho-communist society, white nationalists, religious people, whether they be pagans, Muslims, or Christians, are going to be oppressed and dispossessed, as we saw in Spain and Ukraine. Christians were brutally murdered by anarchists. So I think they would be acting in a class interest contrary to my interest. And an interest of capitalists as well. The petite bourgeoisie were also slaughtered in the Ukraine and Spain. And so these things are somewhat ad hoc. One of the things that I've noticed is I think anarchism, now on paper, it stands against all forms of systemic oppression. That thing in practice it doesn't, and I'll get into that a little bit later. Now, you mentioned that there's a disagreement on what's oppression. And the anarcho-communist would say working in a corporation, a hierarchical power structure, where a CEO and the hierarchy of power leaves you at the mercy of them, is oppressive. It's not democratic. You don't have a lot of choices. There's certainly some plausibility to that. But unlike a state, I mean, you could just quit your job. I mean, nobody's going to say you can't quit generally. And with the anarchists, the other thing is, I remember there's this one interview back in, I think it was the 60s or 70s, where Noam Chomsky was interviewed by a Canadian. He was a generic social democrat. And he was asking him, what's the nature of anarchism? And Noam Chomsky was going through the rounds. And then Noam Chomsky said that labor would be shared. You know, the foundational labor that you need for society, like, you know, cleaning latrines or farming in the field, everybody would take their turn. And the social democrat from Canada said, what if they don't want to take their turn? What do you do then? And Noam Chomsky basically just said, we're just going to force them to work if they don't take their turn. And personally, for me, it's like, would I rather have a boss that I could quit, or an anarchist or a kind of collectivist commune where if I get outvoted, I got to clean the bathroom no matter what? That seems to me more authoritarian than working for a boss. And frankly, I think on a somewhat side issue, when it comes to collective ownership of property, the sort of benchmark is the toilet. My dad he did a mission trip to Russia before the Soviet Union fell down, like in the late 80s. And he went to a Soviet restroom. This was like a high-class restroom, like, you know, for the Politburo guys, or at least apparatchiks, high-level apparatchiks. And he wanted to use the restroom, and the guy's like, no, you got to take 3 toilet bowl covers first. And he's like, why? Well, he's like, because they stole the toilet seats. So he goes into the bathroom, and there was this like a film of black filth all around the rim of the toilet because the lid has been taken off. So he has to put down these 3 toilet covers onto the lid to actually use it. And I'm like, that's the problem. Collectivists always have horrible hygiene. I mean, I think, well, I shouldn't say always. I mean, religious communes like the monastery or Tolstoy tend to be a little bit cleaner. But if I'm not mistaken, even Occupy Wall Street was canceled because of public health hazards. And okay.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of areas we could explore with some of these kinds of questions. When it comes to economic structures, there's always the debate among left and right in mainstream society about who's worse, the government or the corporations. The left usually comes down on the position that the corporations are worse. The right, at least in the United States, comes down on the question that the government is worse. I tend to think both sides in that often have ulterior motives. Like I think a lot of the Republicans who say they're against big government really aren't so anti-big government, and a lot of the left who say they're against corporations, they're kind of giving them a wink and the nod on the side while they're denouncing them publicly. But when it comes to that issue, I tend to shy away from the interpretations of political economy that involve this idea that there's somehow some great dichotomy between big business and big government. I don't really buy into that dichotomy that I think regrettably defines a lot of mainstream American political discourse. I tend to look at the question of the state in terms of what and in terms of what C. Wright Mills rather called the power elite. C. Wright Mills was a sociologist who taught at Columbia, I believe, in the 50s and 60s. He was in his 40s when he died, so he didn't last very long. But he had this theory of the power elite, and what he basically argued, and he was somewhat influenced by classical anarchism. And in fact, I think he actually admitted that at one time, that his views were very similar to that of classical anarchism. But he said that the power elite in society are those who are pulling the strings of the institutions. And this includes not only the political government, the Congress and the president and the bureaucracy and all that, but it also includes other elite institutions. It includes corporations and banks and financial institutions, institutions that control a lot of wealth and property and so forth. And it also includes institutions that can pull society strings in other ways. That would include institutions that shape thinking and consciousness. Like in our society, it would be the media and the educational system, the universities and all that, and the mass media certainly, and that would also include obviously the institutions that exist to exercise raw force if necessary, the police and the military and all that. So I tend to hold to that view of what the state is or what the ruling class is. The state is not merely the political institutions, the big government or whatever, and the state is not merely the economic elites. The state is this entire spectrum of power elites on an institution-wide, society-wide basis. So I want to clarify that, and that to really hold to that kind of analysis, I think you have to go against a lot of orthodoxy on both the left and the right, because it's not really a matter of capitalism versus the state or vice versa. It's capitalism and the state are kind of intertwined with each other, or at least state capitalism. There's again, that gets into this question of what is capitalism. But as far as talking about the difference between bosses and states and collectivism and individualism, I tend to come down on the point of view that the state itself, the political state, has powers that even businesses don't have. If you, even if you're working for a mega corporation like General Motors, the worst they're going to do to you is fire you if they don't like you. I mean, which is not necessarily a small thing. If you're a middle-aged guy with 5 kids and a mortgage and health insurance premiums you've got to pay every month, been getting fired is not necessarily a trivial matter. And so, and business interests of that type can do a lot of damage to workers and consumers and communities and the environment and all kinds of things. So I'm not coming to their rescue. I'm not taking Ayn Rand's position that big business is an oppressed minority. But I do hold to the view that the state has unique powers. The political government has unique powers that other institutions do not. The state has the means of amassing nuclear weapons through taxation. The state has the power of taxation. It can raise the kind of capital, the kind of resources necessary to develop nuclear weapons and create a military industrial complex. The state can pass laws that if you don't obey, they send people out with guns to put you in a cage. That's what they do. Now, it can be argued, well, corporations and other private interests can simply lobby the state or essentially bribe the state to do that on their behalf. Yeah, but they still have to do it in an indirect way. So I think that argument is one where I tend to agree more with the anarcho-capitalist, although I'm a lot more critical of corporate power and business power than the anarcho-capitalists usually are. I tend to side more with the left anarchists on that issue. As far as actual, the benefits and burdens of living in different kinds of communities, Chomsky actually lived on one of the Israeli kibbutzim when he was young, like probably in the 1940s, probably about the time Israel was getting started. And I think that's still kind of, even in his old age, what is he, 87 or something now, I think that he still sort of holds to that model or that kind of experience as what his ideal type of socialism would be. And there are communes. There's a place not far from me called Twin Oaks. It's a fairly well-known commune, and some friends of mine, some anarchist friends of mine, lived there for a while. In fact, I actually did a podcast with them talking about that at one point. But they're sort of the model. Twin Oaks, I think, is kind of the model of what a lot of anarcho-communists or left anarchists envision, where, yeah, it's a collective enterprise and they're sharing in the work. And, there's generally rules. You have to take your turn sweeping the floor or whatever. And if you don't comply, if you just want to be a freeloader, they can kick you out. I don't really have a personal preference for that kind of thing. But on the other hand, I would differentiate between that and actual state communism. The Soviet system was just one big, massive bureaucracy. I mean, the Soviet system was like the post office writ large. Imagine if all of society's institutions were run like the post office or the division of motor vehicles. It's just a massive, massive bureaucracy. That's
a Kafkaesque nightmare.
Yeah. I mean, think about all the bureaucracies that we deal with, state bureaucracies we deal with. Think about, if you lose your birth certificate and have to go get another one, or you have to get your driver's license renewed, or or dealing with just the post office, some basic services like that. All state services of that type, they tend to be very inefficient in many ways. The buildings that they're in tend to not be very well maintained. Because nobody really cares if the janitor swept the floor that morning. And the people there aren't that happy to see you when you show up. Like if you go to the Division of Motor Vehicles to get your driver's license renewed, they don't act like they're really happy to see you. They're like, what do you want? Why are you here? Pick a number, get in line. And that's really what the Soviet model of communism was. I mean, the Soviet Union was that writ large. I mean, the Soviet Union was a nation of hundreds of millions of people living under the rule of the Division of Motor Vehicles, backed up by the secret police. And that's how that's why socialism and communism have such a horrible connotation to most people, I think, because of that. But I don't really have any specifically stated preferences personally as to whether I'd rather live somewhere like the Twin Lakes commune on an Israeli kibbutzim or work for a business enterprise. I mean, right now I'm largely I largely work as an independent contractor. And I have business associates that are basically partners. And I also work for a university where I'm basically a subcontractor as well. I kind of like that. I guess I'm a petit bourgeois, if you want to be Marxist about it. So I guess that seems to work well for me. And a lot of anarchists, particularly libertarian-minded anarchists, tend to like that as well. But I do think that there is, again, there's a lot of gray area in terms of how we go about defining what the state is and what exploitation is and what oppression is. Speaking of this issue of, well, who's most oppressed, were taxpayers oppressed? Again, this is another ANCAP argument. ANCAP say taxation is theft. Taxpayers are basically being subject to armed robbery by the state. That's what the income tax is. That's what taxes are. ANCOMs tend to not worry quite as much about taxes. They're more worried about labor exploitation. And they say, all these poor folks that work at McDonald's and Walmart they have jobs where if you have 3 of them, you still can't pay rent. They're really the ones that are being oppressed. Their labor is being exploited. I actually tend to agree with both points of view. I'm not a real big fan of taxes and and I'm certainly not a fan of what tax revenue is often used for.
So you disagree with Noam Chomsky about the greatness of tax day?
Yeah, I really hope he was being facetious when he made that comment about how April 15th should be a national holiday because we celebrate our collective efforts as a society to go out and, make a policy and implement it. I mean, that's nonsensical. It's, Noam Chomsky is obviously an extremely intelligent man, and I very much respect him as a person. In my personal correspondence with him, he's always been very forthcoming and gracious and friendly and gentlemanly, and certainly his critique of American foreign policy is very valuable. He's magnificent on foreign policy issues, and also his other work in terms of analyzing systems of propaganda and so forth, and the media, and even his work in linguistics. I'm not as knowledgeable in that field, but a lot of that is really interesting as well. But yeah, he's such a knee-jerk anti-rightist, if you will, that he ends up saying things that just end up sounding ridiculous. He has a serious case of right-wingophobia. I guess that should be the newest phobia or whatever. There's Islamophobia, there's xenophobia, there's homophobia, there's transphobia. Maybe we should have right-wingophobia as well, because if anybody's got it, he does. He just seems really, he has just a really knee-jerk, almost neurotic, it seems, hostility to anything he considers right-wing. But I actually tend to agree with ANCAPs, about taxes in the sense that, if you really want to, get down to it, yeah, it amounts to a shakedown racket, and I think even more objectionable is what it's often used for. But I also sympathize with the ANCOM position that the Walmart workers, the McDonald's workers, the migrant farm workers. I mean, yeah, there is an element of exploitation there. Earlier in life, I worked in some places kind of like that. I know at one point I worked at a well-known convenience store chain, and that place, was just about trying to get as much out of you as they possibly could, but to them, you were just a number on their balance sheet. And that was it. So I tend to be sympathetic to the ANCOM position on that kind of stuff, much more so than ANCAPs normally are. So, I'm got a foot in both camps with those kinds of issues. And the same is true with the social and cultural issues. There's this back and forth now in the mainstream society about who's most oppressed. Once again, are blacks most oppressed by racism or police brutality, or whites oppressed by political correctness or affirmative action, or gays oppressed by religion or religion by gays. And I don't really see any of those kinds of issues either as being a zero-sum game or whatever. I think that I would prefer that there be more nuance when it comes to some of those kinds of questions. For example, when it comes to racism, certainly American racial history is awful, beyond awful. I think it could be argued, for example, that blacks historically in the United States really played the same role as the Dalit people in India. They weren't really even a proletarian or peasant class. They were a caste of largely outcast people. And the Native American people, I guess you could say, they're basically the Palestinians of North America. So certainly American racial history is terrible. On the other hand, the left, and a lot of the left anarchists are pretty bad about this, but they seem to view all of society as just one big racist conspiracy. Like everybody in institutions everywhere is just going to work every day, seeing what they can do to oppress a person of color or something. And I think, when it comes to things like when they talk about privilege theory, they talk about white privilege and all of that kind of stuff. I tend to look at it like, well, all other variables being equal, it's probably more advantageous in the United States to be white than to be something else. But I think the other variables matter as well. It's in some ways, I think white privilege is basically the Jewish conspiracy of the left. And the same is true with some of these other kinds of issues, the gay rights thing. Nobody in contemporary society wants to go back to the days when gays were subject to electric shock and lobotomies and stuff like that as some kind of supposed medical treatment. On the other hand, when we start saying, well, gays can sue bakery owners for not baking them a wedding cake or something, that seems to me to be intruding on other people's rights, their freedom of association and freedom of religion and private property rights and that kind of thing. It's basically that spills over into the area of the right to go where you're not wanted, and if you are you invited, or should you be required to allow people into your house, to invite people into your house you don't want to invite into your house? So it seems like to me some of that it gets a bit carried away.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to bring up is with more with anarcho-capitalists, but to some extent with anarcho-communists as well. There seems to be this a weakness in the theory in this sense that they assume that if the state is abolished, I've heard this so many times by ANCAPs, if the state's abolished, the process of the centralization of power will stop, and we'll enter in the new utopia, the ANCAP Marxist utopia. History's ended, the state's defeated, and we'll just go on till the heat death of the universe. But the problem is, power is always centralized no matter what. Before the first city-states of Babylonia, we lived in a state of anarchy, pretty much. But it didn't last because they couldn't resist these city-states from Babylon and then later Egypt. And eventually they became empires. And one of the few honest anarchists that I've come across on this issue is Roger T. Long. He wrote in 1994-95 an article called Defending a Free Nation, where he talks about how a left anarcho-capitalist society, a left Rothbardian society, could defend itself. He lists nonviolent and violent means. But he says something very important that I find to be really honest. He says, this would be an impressive military force. And by that he means professional mercenaries, militias, and nonviolent resistance. This would be an impressive military force, I think. And it makes me wonder what will protect other nations from us. As I've read more and more ancient and medieval history, I've come to realize that anarchic, decentralized, egalitarian, individualistic societies are not necessarily peaceful societies. The Celtic and Viking societies we admire so much as libertarian models were among the most effective raiders and conquerors in history. What is to prevent our free nation from becoming a threat to the security of other nations, and thus ultimately a threat to its own security as those nations are provoked into attacking us? And I think this raises a very interesting question, because prior to the age of gunpowder, around 1500, the greatest threat to your life and limb was not the emperor, it was the barbarian over the hills, whether it's Turks or Mongols or Huns or Vikings or Berbers or Arabs. These sort of non-state actors, these tribal actors, until the age of gunpowder. I mean, Tamerlane killed tens of millions of people, as did Genghis Khan. I think in many ways they were a greater threat to your life and limb than the king in Rome, the emperor in Rome, or the king in Babylon, or the emperor in China. But and I think with technology is often seen as a great leveler. People that are weaker tend to have more power because they're able to then fight back with new technologies. And I wonder if the pendulum might be swinging where the state loses power to more like we see with modern day terrorism. I mean, if terrorists were to detonate an atomic weapon in a big city, that would be just as destructive as if a government did it. And I feel like this is kind of fetish with governments. Yes, they're dangerous. Yes, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, the United States have all killed millions of people. We need to be aware of that. But I think, historically, that's not the case. Historically, it was these nomadic, tribal, decentralized societies that were the great conquerors and warlords of history. And it's possible that technology might swing the pendulum back in that direction. And the anarchists on the right and the left really don't have an answer to that. If decentralized systems can be great conquerors, warlords, and genocidal lunatics, what do they have in place to stop that from happening again, as it did in the past?
Yeah, there's an interesting book by an anarchist named Harold Barclay. He was a professor of anthropology at Cornell for a number of years. And one thing that he was really interested in was studying older, more primitive societies and their social structures and looking for proto-anarchies among them, among indigenous people and all of that. But one thing that he says in one of his works, he has a book called The Anthropology of Anarchy. And he says that one thing that is obvious is that as soon as power becomes decentralized, it very rapidly becomes centralized once again in many instances. That there's the question of the power vacuum. Power abhors a vacuum, and when a power vacuum is created, it often is restored fairly quickly. And Barclay's answer to that was, well, the battle is forever, meaning that there's never going to be. I mean, I certainly know I don't believe in some end game. I don't believe in some final stage in history where we have finally abolished the state and anarchy rules, forevermore. That's not really the view that I have at all. I do think there's a such thing as social progress. I do think social progress can take place. I think, just like technological progress can take place. I mean, we don't have chattel slavery anymore in most of the world. There's a few places that still have it, but for the most part, we don't really have that. And we don't have other things that were practiced in the past in many countries today that, I would view that, where I would view as social progress. On the other hand, the idea that we're going to have this end state, this kind of utopia at the end of things is a bit of a reach. Now, I'll grant you that there are plenty of anarchists that believe that, or at least implicitly seem to believe that there's this final stage. The day's going to come, we're going to be there. And there are anarcho-capitalists and anarcho-communists, left anarchists, both who believe that. or at least implicitly believe that. I tend to not really hold to a view like that. I tend to, for one thing, I don't really have this kind of linear view of history. I tend to think that history tends to be more cyclical. I think that you see what you see in history is the rise and fall of societies and civilizations and cultures, and a civilization can become very advanced and prosperous, and then it can just fall apart. And something can come along in its place that's something of a regression. There's plenty of historical examples of that. And I also think that's true when it comes to the distribution of power. You can see, for example, phases in history where power tended to be dispersed and decentralized, and then it tends to re-centralize itself, or vice versa. So I tend to think all these kinds of things tend to be more cyclical. As far as the idea of, well, what about violence and plunder and conquest carried out by groups that aren't really states in a conventional sense? They aren't modern, heavily centralized states like the United States, the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany or whatever. That's obviously one of the issues that fourth generation warfare theory raises. I know that you are familiar with William S. Lind, and I think you and he maybe even worked together or been interviewed together on different programs.
That's true.
And Bill Lind, talks about how, well, a real problem is the fact that, in his view, it's a problem that states are declining in terms of their reach in many ways due to technology and globalization and things like that. Because in his view, a real problem is the rise of non-state military actors who are in a position to carry out all kinds of crazy terrorist operations, like Al Qaeda and stuff like that. That's an issue. I mean, just because something is outside the state doesn't mean that it's benevolent or benign. One argument, of course, that a lot of left type people will raise as well, oppression can come from any kind of social hierarchy, and they'll talk about how, what about an abusive parent, that a man that beats his wife and kids, or or things like that. And then people, even people on the right, will make similar arguments. They'll talk about crime, for example. They'll say, well, yeah, of course we want to keep the power of the police at bay, but at some point we've got to control crime as well. And those are issues. I mean, those are real issues. Those people who make those kinds of arguments aren't just being silly. And the idea of, what about terrorist groups or private non-state or, non-state actors that are incapable of engaging in a lot of violence? In fact, I had someone ask me recently, well, in your system, what would you do about a group like ISIS or Al Qaeda or whatever? And to which I would say, as Jefferson did, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. You have to safeguard against that kind of stuff the best you can, and that's the same thing. The same thing is true with the centralization of power and the growth of the state. As far as my own approach to anarchism, I mean, people who are familiar with all the stuff I've written about anarchist theory online and in my book and other places, they know that I'm not really an anarchist of the left or of the right. I'm a little bit of both, and I blend a lot of things together. But what I'm interested in is that 0 to 100 scale I was talking about. I'm interested in promoting just about all anti-state or libertarian or decentralist or anarchist anti-authoritarian movements. I want to grow all of these so that they're collectively large and influential. And along with some overarching ideas like secession, secession by localities and regions from centralized governments and those kinds of things. But I still think that the battle is forever, in the sense that, let's say that ANCAPs and ANCOMs and anarcho-nationalists and national anarchists and anarcho-primitivists and Christian anarchists and all these other groups start becoming a large, influential movement or collections of movements. Well, within their own ranks, they're still going to have their own problems. You're still going to have, abusive, opportunistic leaders. You're still going to have people that do harm to each other. You're still going to have people that want to make all kinds of compromises with the state, people who, you're still going to have organizations where a kind of natural leadership emerges. There's a so-called iron law of oligarchy that Robert Michaels thought up, where it was the idea was, well, all organizations of any size tend to be oligarchies, where you have the few leading the many. And then there's Pareto's 80-20 principle, the idea that in an organization, about 20% of the organization ends up carrying about 80% of the weight, and that becomes the leadership. So all of these problems would still exist in any kind of organization or any kind of movement, no matter how anarchistic it was, or no matter how pure its ideals. So I don't hold to this kind of view that there's some kind of utopian endgame in the future. I think it's more a matter of the least bad option, or as far as the 0 to 100 scale, try to move as close as you can to 100 and as far from 0 as you can, but recognizing that there is a continuum in all of these things. Again, it's I talked earlier in the program. I don't know if it was this program or the last podcast. I mentioned how some of the leading theorists of anarchism, like Kropotkin, for example, did not recognize the medieval republics as actual states, or didn't recognize the actual Greek cities as actual states. But even those had their excesses and abuses. In the Greek cities, for example, the status of women was very low in that culture. Now you can argue that's cultural, not political. But they also had slavery in that system as well. So, in any kind of system, you can have excesses, you can have abuses, you can have opportunistic leaders, you can have corruption, you can have authoritarian tendencies. I think that in any kind of system, people will be people. I'm not somebody who thinks that human nature necessarily changes according to institutional changes. Certainly beliefs and values people have can change. For example, when we think about the Aztec culture, this was a culture that literally believed that you put someone on an altar and rip their heart out or whatever, and this is a sacred ritual. That was their idea of church or something like that.
The Mayans had that too.
Yeah. So certainly human beings can have just widely divergent beliefs and values. But I still think people are people. I still think people are going to be people in any kind of system. So I tend to disagree with those kinds of anarchists who have this kind of view that views anarchy as some kind of utopian endgame. I tend to be, Harold Barclay, the anarchist anthropologist who taught at Cornell that I mentioned earlier, he said that what he was he said he was into anarcho-syndicalism, not anarcho-syndicalism, but anarcho-cynicalism, in the sense that the battle against oppressive authority is forever. It's a permanent battle.
Yeah, well, it's been a bit out long. I'm really glad to have had you on for part 2. So I'll leave you with the last word before we wrap it up.
Okay. Well, once again, if you're interested in finding out more about the work that I do, you can go to the website for attackthesystem.com, attackthesystem.com. I also have a book called Attack the System, where I outline some of my own ideas on anarchist theory and strategy and application. If you're interested in learning more about anarchism and the anarchist tradition, I'd recommend a book called Demanding the Impossible. Demanding the Impossible by Peter Marshall. It's a long book, about 800 pages long, but it's actually available online. You can actually find a PDF version online and read it online. You don't actually have to buy it. But that really, I think, is a good overview. It's really the definitive work when it comes to the anarchist history and tradition. So definitely check that out.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on, Keith. This is Todd Lewis from Praise Folly podcast signing out.